The author Paulo Coelho writes this: "When you find your own path, you must not be afraid. You need to have sufficient courage to make mistakes. Disappointment, defeat, and despair are the tools God uses to show us the way." Over the past 3 years, our parish has been involved in a project known as Creating a Culture of Calling, the C3 project. We have been part of a network of Christian churches around the United States, quite a few of them Roman Catholic parishes, who are focusing on how we can understand and help the members of our parishes understand that God is always calling us, not just once in terms of what I want to be when I grow up, or who I should marry, or what I should do with my life, but at all the various stages and circumstances of life, God is calling us to a deeper awareness of who we are and who we are called to be. Here at St. Charles, over the past 3 years, our Faith 365 program, our Lenten Vespers, our gift program, are just a few of the many ministries that have focused on helping all of us consider how we are being called in whatever circumstance we find ourselves today. Our podcast, From Where I Stand, was actually a project that we created as part of this C3 process. And if you have never listened to this podcast, From Where I Stand, I really encourage you to do so, because it gives you a great insight into the various and very often unusual experiences in which a person receives a calling. So I really encourage you to listen to it. So I was thinking about this, creating a culture of calling, when I was preparing for today's reflection. Today is the feast of St. Matthias, and we celebrate today his calling to be a disciple. Now, after the ascension of the Lord, the early disciples decided that it was important to replace Judas, who had not only betrayed Jesus, but now had died. So it was important for them to keep the number 12 intact, and they decided they're going to have an open call for those who might be considered as his replacement. So what were they looking for? What kind of person did they feel would be called to be the 12th disciple? It was very simple if you read today's scripture. The person, number one, had to be with Jesus from the beginning, meaning to say from the time of his baptism, the beginning of his ministry, through his death on the cross, the person had to have accompanied Jesus and heard him, seen him, understood his message. The second thing was that the person had to have witnessed with his own eyes the risen Jesus. So it finally comes down to two. And we're told it comes down to a guy named Matthias and a man who is called Joseph. But by the way, he was also called Barsabbas. And also, by the way, some people called him Justus. So how did they choose between the two men? There was no essay contest. There was no great debate moderated by some local news anchor. No, the group prayed. They prayed. And then they rolled the dice. So basically, the replacement was chosen, not with some great elaborate process, but sort of like one that resembled rocks, paper, scissors, and that's how they chose Matthias. So Matthias is chosen, and the rest is history. He becomes the replacement for Judas. He is known then, the legends are that he went and brought the faith to many different places. There are churches now named for him, holy cards with his picture on, and we all live happily ever after. Or so we might think, but that's not the whole story. The other guy, this guy that is known by 3 different names, he seems just to fade into history, never heard from again. But in more recent years, as people have done some reflection on this passage from Scripture, the question does get raised. What happened to Joseph, sometimes called Barsabbas, also known as Justus? What's up with this guy? And makes you wonder, why did he even have 3 names? What's the backstory there about him? I searched through the internet to see if there are any artistic images of this man. This is the only thing that I could come up with. It's not really much of anything. I think it's from one of the early catacombs or one of the early frescoes of the ancient church. According to tradition, Justus went to become the bishop of a city called Eleutheropolis. I have no idea where that is. I think it's somewhere in Greece, maybe. But the only problem is that the city didn't exist until well after this man had lived. So there's the idea that he really probably couldn't have actually been the bishop of that city. The only thing that sources seem to agree on is that this man, who wasn't chosen, did die as a martyr for the faith. But over the years, and especially this past week, I've been reading reflections about Joseph Justus Barsabbas. And it's interesting that many of the reflections I've read kind of have thoughts that I've felt over the many years that I've considered this passage. The guy, some suggest, is the patron saint of most of us, maybe all of us, because most of us had an experience when we were not chosen, when we were not appreciated, maybe a time when we thought we were very easily forgotten. Nobody ever asked about us again or wondered how we were. That's why Paulo Coelho's words came to me when I read today's gospel. Disappointment, defeat, and despair are the tools God uses to show us the way. It reminds me that our calling does not always come in a moment of great success, moments when we're being surrounded by congratulations and well wishes. Our calling doesn't always come with a reward, or even with some kind of recognition that you're the best or you're the greatest. It's often our calling coming from a moment of disappointment or defeat or despair, a moment in which we think maybe even God has forgotten me. But those are more often than not the moments, if we're paying attention, that God's presence and God's love are most clearly felt, most clearly seen. How many of us have had an experience in which we might look back and say, that experience, I hated what happened. I wished it didn't happen. But if it hadn't happened, I wouldn't be who I am today. That's grace. That's grace when we can understand that our calling comes in so many different circumstances. And it's not about being remembered for doing something great, but believing that God remembers me and will never stop loving me. I reflected on St. Matthias, and especially the man with three names, because I was ordained a priest on the feast of St. Matthias 38 years ago today. It is a reminder to me that yes, the vocation of priesthood, but all vocations, all of them, it's a journey that is at times challenging and satisfying, sometimes uncertain, sometimes filled with many blessings, but always a journey that's powered by grace. It's a journey that I am grateful for, and a journey that I continue to hear being called to in different and new ways as life unfolds, as circumstances change. So, in the next life, I would certainly like to meet St. Matthias, to whom I'm forever linked because I was ordained on his feast day. But even more, I'd like to sit and have a drink with the man who was not chosen. I'd like to sit with him. And the first thing after I sat in my chair, I would say, hey, what's with the three names? And what should I call you? And then after that was settled, I would just sit back and I would say to him, tell me your story.